Good morning, my dear students. Today we are going to start with our next lesson, that is the poetry After Blenheim by Robert Southey. It is an anti-war poem that sharply criticizes the destruction and death caused by war. Now let us learn something about the poet. Robert Southey was an English poet of the Romantic school. He was one of the Lake poets along with William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge. Southey was appointed a poet laureate for 30 years from 1813 until his death in 1843. He was a prolific letter writer, literary scholar, essay writer, historian, and biographer. His famous works include Fall of Robespierre, After Blenheim, Thalaba the Destroyer, Letters from England, The Life of Nelson. His everlasting work is the children's classic, The Story of the Three Bears. After Blenheim is a powerful anti-war poem that stresses upon the atrocities and futility of war. This poem describes the Battle of Blenheim that took place in the year 1704 between the English and the Austrians on the one side and the French on the other side. In the poem, the grandfather, Old Caspar, calls the Battle of Blenheim as a great victory. He praises the heroism of English soldiers. His grandchildren, Wilhelmine and Peterkin, who have discovered a human skull, fail to understand how a destructive war can be called a famous victory. The poem After Blenheim makes us ponder on the purpose and results of a war and even questions its validity. Before we start the poem, let us learn something about the Battle of Blenheim. Blenheim is a town situated on the bank of Danube River in South Germany. The Battle of Blenheim was fought on 13th August 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession. In November 1700, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France acceded to the throne of Spain as Philip V. Austria and other European nations saw this development as an unfair maneuver by Louis to increase his power and influence. Consequently, war broke out in 1701 between Austria and France. England and the Netherlands allied themselves with Austria. The German principalities of Bavaria and Cologne and the Italian principalities of Mantua and Savoy allied themselves with France. As the war progressed, Portugal and various German dominions including Prussia and Hanover entered the war on the side of Austria. In addition, Savoy renounced its allegiance to the French and joined the anti-French coalition. In 1704, the coalition defeated French and Bavarian forces at Blenheim. Among the conquering heroes were England's Duke of Marlborough and Savoy's Prince Eugene. Stanza 1. It was a summer evening. Old Caspar's work was done. and he, before his cottage door, was sitting in the sun, and by him, spotted on the green, his little grandchild Wilhelmine. The poem begins by picturizing a vivid scene of a summer evening. It is time when most of the people return from work. The days are long and tiring in summers. The sun sets late in the evening. So here, an elderly farmer named Caspar is sitting in front of his cottage watching his grandchild Wilhelmine at play on the lush green field. So students, we see that when the poem starts, the setting is ideal, which is peaceful and comfortable. Stanza 2. She saw her brother Peterkin roll something large and round, which he beside the rivulet in playing there had found. He came to ask what he had found that was so large and smooth and round. Now here, Wilhelmine was sitting near her grandfather, and she saw that her brother Peterkin was rolling something large, smooth and round, which he had found beside the river. Now here the poet creates a suspense in the reader's mind. He does not directly state what it was, but he just tells casually that Peterkin found some object which is round, smooth and large. So the setting of the poem and the object which he finds gives a sharp contrast, bringing forth the horrors of war. So Peterkin is very curious about this object which he found, to show it to his grandfather, and wants to know more about it. Stanza 3. Old Caspar took it from the boy, who stood expectant by, and then the old man shook his head, and with a natural sigh, "It's some poor fellow's skull," said he, "who fell in the great victory." Caspar took the round thing from Peterkin, who was very excited to know about the object. After a brief look at the object, the old man shook his head with sigh and told them that it was a skull of a soldier who might have died in the war, that is, the Battle of Blenheim. Caspar calls this battle a great victory. Stanza 4. I find them in the garden, for there is many here about, and often when I go to plough, the ploughshare turns them out. For many thousand men, said he, were slain in that great victory. Here, Caspar is talking about the Battle of Blenheim. The first reference to the war comes in this stanza. He says that the Battle of Blenheim led to the death of thousands of soldiers whose corpses lie deep scattered in the fields. Further, Caspar relates how he had found many such objects while ploughing in the fields. These skulls, which he finds in the garden, gives us a visual imagery which is quite gruesome. The horrors of war can be presented through these skulls, which come out when the farmer is ploughing the field. The great victory, which refers to the triumph in the battle, also happens to be an example of patriotism. Caspar believed that the soldiers sacrificed their life for the country and did not die in vain. Their death served the purpose of victory in the battle. Stanza 5. Now tell us what it was all about. Young Peterkin, he cries, and little Wilhelmine looks up with wonder-waiting eyes. Now tell us all about the war and what they fought each other for. Hearing about the battle, now the children were getting restless to know more about it. They were constantly trying to persuade their grandfather to tell them more about the war. For them, the battle seems to bring the thrill along with the excitement and amazement. Little Wilhelmine is so curious to know about the war that it reflected in her eyes, which were gleaming for a wonder to unfold. She is curious to know about the war, and she expects that she will listen to a fantastic story from her grandfather. Stanza 6. It was the English, Caspar cried, who put the French to rout. But what they fought each other for, I could not well make out. But everybody said, quoth he, that it was a famous victory. Now students, we know that the British defeated the Franco-Bavarian army in the Battle of Blenheim. So Caspar tries to answer the questions posed by his grandchildren by telling them this piece of information. He says that he doesn't know the reason behind the war. He only knows what everybody told him, that this victory was a famous one. And he continues to repeat it without knowing the reason for the war. Stanza 7. My father lived at Blenheim then, yon little stream hard by. They burned his dwelling to the ground, and he was forced to fly. So with his wife and child he fled, nor had he where to rest his head. Now Caspar recollects from the past some of the gruesome scenarios of the war. He begins by remembering his father, who lived in a small village of Blenheim near a river. The French wreaked havoc in the village and burnt homes of several innocent people to the ground. Consequently, the villagers were forced to migrate in search of shelter. The young Caspar, along with his parents, fled to a different place but could not find a home because of the impending war. They had to roam from one place to another, seeking shelter as they became homeless. Stanza 8. With fire and sword, the country round was wasted far and wide, and many a childing mother then and newborn baby died. But things like that, you know, must be at every famous victory. In this stanza, the poet describes the horrors of war. The fire and the sword are symbols of human cruelty and destruction. The poet says that the whole country was burning and innocent people were killed. It was a shattered and ruined picture presented through these lines. The fire and sword represent the destruction and death. It presents an image of a land made barren. It shows both the futility of war and its power to destroy. The poet says that many pregnant ladies and the newborn babies were killed in this war. It makes us understand that the battle is catastrophic to both the present and future. It powerfully evokes the death of the innocents. The idea here is to express how thousands of innocent lives are taken in due course of a futile and meaningless war that is sure to bring only damage and destruction. The irony here is evident when Caspar says that these things are meant to happen at every battle where there is a great victory. Whether he believes it or not, Caspar has resigned to the inevitability of death. That's why he takes those killings very casually and thinks that it must be there at every such victory. Famous victory, this word is intentionally repeated by the poet to create a sense of irony. Stanza 9. They say it was a shocking sight after the field was won, for many thousand bodies here lay rotting in the sun. But things like that, you know, must be after a famous victory. Now in these lines, the poet is talking about the after effects of war. He is telling us the dreadful sight which can be seen after the war was won. The poet, through Caspar, goes on to describe the agony of war. He mentions the shocking sight of the battlefield that was full of dead bodies of the soldiers which were decaying in the sun. There is no burial for these bodies. Through this image, the poet attempts to bring into consideration the indignity in the way the soldiers lay. The bodies of these soldiers are reduced to a mere status of an inanimate object. There is no dignity, no glory in war, but only misery. Even after such horrifying aspects of the war, Caspar regards it as a famous victory. It emphasizes on the ignorance of the old man about the purpose and consequence of war. Stanza 10. Great praise the Duke of Marlborough won, and our good Prince Eugene. Why, it was a very wicked thing, said little Wilhelmine. Nay, nay, my little girl, quoth he, it was a famous victory. Now in these lines, the poet mentions the Duke of Marlborough, who was an English general. He was the commander of the British forces in the Battle of Blenheim. Prince Eugene and Duke of Marlborough represented Britain in the battle and defeated the French at Blenheim. Caspar here sang praises for the men who brought the famous victory to the nation. The little Wilhelmine is confused and she says that war is a wicked thing. She is wondering how her grandpa could sing praises of such a bloody war. Here, for the first time in the poem, we see a disapproval of the false glory of war. But shutting the little child up, Caspar goes on repeating the same thing and says, "No, no, my little girl." And he says that this war was a famous victory. Now it is obvious that the old man is trying to hide all the destruction and agony caused by the war by repeating the same two words, that is, a famous victory. Stanza 11. And everybody praised the Duke who this great fight did win. But what good came of it at last? Quoth little Peterkin. Why, that I cannot tell, said he, but it was a famous victory. In these lines, the poet says that many people praised the Duke for having won the war. Caspar also recalls this with some delight, and he says that this was a great fight. Peterkin then anticipated on the very purpose of war, and he asks a question to his grandfather that what good comes out of such misery? What did we gain from that war? But the old man didn't have any answer to such questions. All he knew was that it was a famous victory. This remark heightens the sense of irony in the poem, as in spite of such cruelties and casualties, the old man sticks to his illogical belief that the war brought victory to them. Dear students, in our next video, we will discuss the theme, the title justification, the critical appreciation of the poem, and we will also discuss the literary devices used in this poem. In our next video only, you will get the worksheet which you will do in your FAIR Literature in English notebook. Till then, thank you and God bless you.